Please stand. Good morning to those who are with us in the hearing room in Edinburgh and those who are following the inquiry on YouTube. Now, Ms McClelland will be leading evidence today. Ms McClelland, is there any preliminary matters that we need to deal with?
Yes, just one item, my lord. Your lordship will recall that on Monday, Mr McGregor raised the matter of the paper by NHS NSS on ventilation technical guidance, and core participants were given until close of business yesterday to say if they wish to raise any questions with the people who'd prepared that report, and nobody has indicated that they do, and so in light of that, the intention of counsel to the inquiry is not to call them as witnesses. They had been scheduled to appear on Friday the 15th of March, but the view we've taken is that that will not now be necessary.
Thank you. I take it nothing arises out of that. Well, in that case, we can proceed to our first witness.
It's Darren Pike.
Right.
Lord.
Good morning, Mr Pike. As you appreciate, you're about to be asked questions by Mr McClellan, but before that begins, I understand you're prepared to make an affirmation. Just sitting where you are, would you repeat these words after me? I solemnly, sincerely and truly
I solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr Pike. Now, can I ask you to bear in mind that it's quite a large room. People want to hear what you have to say, and I want to hear what you have to say. I'm hard of hearing, so if I could ask you to bear that in mind, maybe just a little louder than you would normally speak in conversation, maybe a little more slowly. This morning we'll be sitting until a lunch break at 1 o'clock, but we'll take a break during the course of the morning, probably about 11:30, for 10 or 15 minutes for coffee. But if at any stage, for any reason, you want to take a break, just give me an indication and we'll take a break. Mr McClellan.
Thank you, my lord. Good morning, Mr Pike.
Good morning.
Could I ask you please just to confirm your name?
Darren Michael Pike.
And you have, I think, prepared a witness statement for the inquiry, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
If we could please have on screen Witness Bundle Volume 3, page 59. And do you see there on the screen, Mr Pike, your witness statement?
Yes.
Does that statement set out fully and truthfully your evidence on the matters that it addresses?
Yes.
And is there anything in it that you think needs to be changed or corrected?
No.
And this is, I think, the first time that you've given oral evidence to this inquiry.
It is, yes.
If we could begin by way of introduction, just with your professional qualifications and experience. Your statement says that you graduated in 1997 with a degree in mechanical engineering.
That's correct, yeah.
And then you worked for 13 years with Balfour Beatty as a mechanical project engineer and then as a project manager.
Yeah, it was Hayden Young, a subsidiary of Balfour Beatty.
And then after that, you've worked with Multiplex for 14 years, I think.
That's correct, yeah.
And are you still with Multiplex?
I am, yes.
And is your current role as a project director with them?
It is.
To what extent have you had experience in the healthcare field?
A reasonable amount of experience in my with my previous employer, I was involved in a few hospitals in Scotland, Wishaw General Hospital, Fife Acute, and then part of when there was a merger with a couple of Belfast beauty companies. When that happened, I worked within the healthcare division.
And was that as a project manager or project director or in any other role?
It was through a couple of roles. One was as a lead engineer, one was as pre-construction managers, and then also as a project and commissioning manager.
And to what extent did any of that work involve work either directly or indirectly in relation to the design of healthcare ventilation systems?
The pre-construction role involved being part of the design management team on the healthcare projects.
And to what extent were you, from that, familiar with the guidance applicable to the design of ventilation systems in healthcare settings?
I would say I was reasonably familiar with it. I wouldn't necessarily say I was an expert, but I was certainly familiar with it.
And at the time you worked on the RHCYP DCN project, were you familiar with SHTM 0301?
I was, yes.
And were you aware that it recommended output parameters to be achieved by the ventilation systems?
I was aware of, the if you like, the full function of 0301, including the output parameters, yeah.
If we could have on screen, please, the document at Bundle 1, page 1173. And do you recognise that document or that page, Mr Pike?
Yes, I do.
This is the Appendix 1 at the end of SHTM 0301, the February 2014 version. And if you look down the column on the left-hand side of that table, about halfway down, do you see a line for critical care areas?
I do, yes.
And as most people in this room will now be familiar with, do we see the recommended air change rate of 10 air changes per hour and the recommended pressure gradient of plus 10 pascals?
Yes.
The term critical care areas, what did you understand that to refer to?
I think over time, trying to put myself back in the mindset at that time rather than a lot of the information that's come out subsequently. Critical care areas was always an area I believed had a bit of debate as to exactly what that covered, because I'm not aware of a specific definition of what those areas are per se. So in terms of the areas themselves, I would usually look to use this document in conjunction with potentially other briefing documents, which would help define exactly where that critical care statement is being applied.
Is it a point that would be discussed with clients?
Yes, it would be.
And when you say there was debate around the meaning of the term, can you expand on that a bit, please?
Yeah, the critical care areas as a general statement within presumably a critical care ward, but then you potentially get HDU wards, you get a number of other wards and function within a hospital that may fall under that definition. And then again, with the term areas, there are other rooms, or there are rooms within a critical care area which have their own definition, or you have dirty utilities which are treated in a specific way, kind of no matter where they are in a hospital. So the actual, what defines the area and what rooms are to be categorised in that area is always something that is a little bit open to interpretation.
Would you understand it to be a recommendation that concerned patient bedding areas?
Yes, I believe it would cover that, or could cover that as well.
I mean, would you understand it to apply to all such bed areas or only to a restricted category of such areas?
I think it would apply to all the bed areas unless there's a specified output which is different.
Okay. Now, you explain in your statement that you joined the RHCYP DCN project in April 2015, so just shortly after financial close.
Yeah.
And that from January 2016, you were Multiplex's project director.
Yes.
And we know from other evidence that one of the tasks after financial close was to complete the ventilation design.
Yeah.
And that was primarily being done by Wallace Whittle.
That's correct, yeah.
What were your responsibilities as project director in relation to the ventilation design?
In a wider sense, as project director, my responsibilities were to ensure that we had appropriate people with our own organisation, but also within the supply chain, capable of delivering the project with the relevant experience, and that those people had the tools and support they needed to do the role they were being asked to do. And then within that, amongst many facets, would sit the M&E design.
Okay, so obviously Wallace Whittle in there as the firm engaged to produce the M&E design. What arrangements, if any, did Multiplex have in place for checking that the design met the board's requirements?
We have a team of design managers. Part of their role is to make sure that we get the information from the design team and we give it to the board. And part of that, they usually have a knowledge in the area that they're working in. So part of that, they would have a check, but they wouldn't necessarily go into the detail of the design.
Okay, so you're describing there a role in which information is effectively being passed by the designer to Multiplex and then by Multiplex onto the board.
Yeah.
And presumably vice versa.
Correct, yeah.
With a degree of knowledge in between. Can you just expand a little bit on what you would expect the people with that knowledge to be doing within Multiplex as the design passes through their hands?
I would expect them to run effectively a sample check and a precursory check against the BCRs or the client's requirements, and to flag anything if they saw anything out of kilter with that. But predominantly I would expect and anticipate them to manage the process more than do the design.
Okay. And so you described there a sample check. Would that cover such things as a check on the compliance of the design with applicable guidance, subject to it being a sample check?
Yeah, to varying degrees of detail, yes, it would.
At paragraphs 9 to 16 of your statement, you discuss the contractual design development process. And what you say is that you weren't involved in the detail of that process, but you were aware of it and monitored it. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
And you, again in your statement, say that the ventilation design for critical care went through the RDD, the reviewable design data process, and that design was approved by NHSL.
Yeah.
What did you understand to be the significance of approval by NHSL?
I understood the significance of the approval by NHSL at that point in the process to be confirmation that the design as progressing and as proposed met the requirements of the contract.
And what aspects of the design did you understand them to be approving?
I understood them to be approving the operational functionality of the design, but also that the design in its whole was aligned with the contract.
And to the extent that the output parameters for the ventilation system were specified in the design, air changes and pressure regimes, did you understand NHSL to be approving those to any extent?
I understood them to be approving that they met their brief.
Sorry,
I
my fault.
understood that they were approving that they met the brief.
Sorry, they were improving the
The ventilation parameters met the brief.
brief.
Yeah, the client's requirements.
Thank you.
Now, as I'm sure you're aware, other parties participating in the inquiry make the point that approval by NHSL of designs submitted through the RDD process had only the limited effect of confirming that the design met their requirements for operational functionality. Do I understand you to be saying you understood it to be doing something more than that?
Yes.
If you could have witness statement bundle 2, page 6, please. Now, Mr Pike, this is the witness statement to the inquiry of Graham Greer of Mott MacDonald. You know who Mr Greer is?
Yep.
I'm just going to ask you a question about what he says in paragraph 11. So I'll read it again out loud in a moment, but if you take a moment to read it and let me know once you've done that, please.
Okay.
Okay. So just picking up from the end of the third line, what Mr Greer says is as follows. My understanding is that NHSL entered into a contract with Project Co to undertake the design in accordance with Project Co's own quality assurance procedures. Do you accept that much?
Yes.
The design would therefore be checked and approved by Project Co prior to issuing RDD submissions through the review procedure. Again, you accept that?
Yes.
NHSL were therefore relying on Project Co's own design assurance and did not undertake a line-by-line review themselves. Do you accept that?
No.
And can you tell me why not?
Pretty much everything that went through RDD, not just this ventilation aspect, was pretty thoroughly checked.
And do you mean by NHSL themselves or by Mott MacDonald or by anybody else?
By a group of people, both NHSL and Mott MacDonald, or potentially a relevant person if there was someone outside the immediate project group that it was thought worthwhile having a review of it.
Okay. Mr Greer carries on. As NHSL had already employed Project Co to undertake the design and design check, NHSL did not ask Mott MacDonald to duplicate that work, and it was not part of Mott MacDonald's remit.
My fault, Mr McLaren. Just the paragraph number?
It's paragraph 11, my lord.
Sorry?
Paragraph 11.
11, thank you.
So, was that your understanding of Mott MacDonald's remit?
I couldn't actually comment on what their remit was. I wasn't party to any contract or agreement between Mott MacDonald or NHSL.
From what you saw of the way they operated on the project, was it consistent or inconsistent with what's said there?
I would say it was inconsistent with what is said there.
And inconsistent in what sense?
And there was a much deeper review undertaken of all the RDD project documentation than is being inferred here.
And then just moving on a couple of lines, Mr Greer says, Mott MacDonald did, however, support NHSL with respect to operational functionality reviews and support NHSL with the sample reviews of the broader RDD submissions. RDD items would be returned as level A, B, C or D. The decision on which level was to be granted would be made by NHSL with input from Mott MacDonald. irrespective of which level was awarded, the approval granted by NHSL under the RDD process related only to operational functionality. Now, I understand from what you've said that you disagree with what Mr Greer said in the final sentence.
Correct, yeah.
The point is also made by some of those involved in the inquiry that the output parameters to be achieved by the ventilation system are not themselves matters of operational functionality. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think I would.
And the upshot of the position taken by the other parties is that even for ventilation designs which NHSL approved under the RDD process, the responsibility for ensuring that the ventilation parameters were appropriate remained with Projectco. Again, was that your understanding?
Yeah, approval through RDD doesn't necessarily remove the design obligation from ourselves. So we still have the obligation for the design to meet the brief and employer's requirements.
Now, Mr Greer, elsewhere in his statement, is paragraph 18 for anybody who wants to follow it up. He acknowledges that NHSL and Mott MacDonald made comments during the RDD process about things other than operational functionality. But what he says is that any such comments were no more than helpful pointers. And I take him to mean that NHSL and Mott were entitled to raise these comments on issues beyond operational functionality and could do so without disturbing the contractual risk allocation for the design. What's your response to that?
My response is yes, they're absolutely entitled to raise any point they wish. However, if there becomes a point whereby they're insisting on a specific change, which we believe meets the criteria of the contract, and they would like it done in a different way, then that would start to lead us into a position where it could potentially be a change to the contract.
Okay. At paragraph 17 to 21 of your statement, you set out your understanding of the environmental matrix. And as I understand what you've said, you understood it to be NHSL's design brief.
Yes.
And by that, do you mean that it set out the parameters which the designers were meant to achieve with their design?
Yes.
And where did your understanding come from?
It came from when I first joined the project. One of the early things I would do is look at what are we contracted to deliver across all aspects of the job. And when we were looking at the M&E aspects, it seemed pretty clear that the environmental matrix as given to the tenderers in the original ITPD was a mandatory document to follow. And therefore, all of the design then flowed from that.
Okay, and your understanding that it was a mandatory document, do you recall where that came from?
Yeah, it came from, first of all, conversations with colleagues, but then follow-up review of the contract, where I can't remember the exact terminology used, but it was something along the lines of the bidders must comply with the environmental matrix or something similar to that.
Okay, I don't think we've got it immediately to hand, but as far as you recall, was that a paragraph in the board's construction requirements themselves that you're recalling?
Yeah, I think, yes.
Was it ever put to you by anyone that the environmental matrix was not NHSL's brief, but was rather Projectco's proposal for meeting the board's construction requirements?
Latterly, that became a point of discussion with NHSL, yes.
And was it NHSL that were advancing that position?
Yes.
And when you say latterly, when approximately do you mean?
Difficult to say exact timelines, somewhere within the body of the project, so potentially somewhere around 2017, when ventilation issues started to come a little bit to the head of a point of dispute.
Okay, so sometime after financial close,
Yeah.
and during the phase in which the design was being developed.
Yeah.
Did anyone ever say to you that the environmental matrix had been supplied as part of a reference design by NHSL and was not intended by them to be taken as a definitive statement of the requirements?
I think, again, yes, that was said.
And
Latterly.
again, at the same time?
Yeah, in that same kind of period.
Yeah. And did anyone explain to you that prior to financial close, Wallace Whittle had been asked to take on the reference design environmental matrix as their own document?
No, I don't recall that specific conversation or notice.
The evidence of Mr McKechnie of Wallace Whittle at the last hearings was that it had been Multiplex who'd asked him to do that. That may have been before your time.
Quite possibly.
And did you understand, going back to your start in the project, did you understand that the environmental matrix was itself subject to the contract design review process?
Yes, maybe not immediately, but relatively early on.
And that design review process is one in which the contractor team submit their design proposals to the health board.
Mm-hmm.
So if the environmental matrix was in fact NHSL's brief, is it, or did you think it at the time, a bit odd that it would go through that process?
No, the environmental matrix contains a lot of data pertaining to all areas of the hospital. As design develops, as the project develops, certain things can change, or certain room types, areas, anything else can perhaps change to a different use than they were originally intended. So it wouldn't be uncommon to resubmit the environmental matrix periodically to check that everything was still correct within how the environmental parameters of each space was going to be treated.
So would you regard that process as an appropriate or suitable one for the finalisation of the client's brief?
I think it's not necessarily finalisation of the brief, it's more ensuring that our design and our intent meets the brief.
You explain in your statement that your understanding was that the environmental matrix was to be subject to the review process only in respect of a limited set of comments that had been made against it by financial close. Is that correct?
That was my starting understanding of what was going to happen through the RDD process, yeah.
And I don't know if you'd recall the contract, but do you remember there being 7 or so points recorded in the reviewable design data schedule of the project agreement? Yeah. So were those the points that you understood were to be the only ones dealt with in the review of the matrix?
That was, like I said, my initial understanding, and that also was wider reaching than just the M&E aspect. That ran for the architectural aspects and the structural aspects as well.
Okay. So to what extent did you understand the various ventilation parameters in the matrix at financial close to be a fixed requirement?
Yeah, my understanding was that was basically the fixed requirement of the deliverables from those systems.
Okay. And what you say in your witness statement, I'm going to read it out. We don't need to have it up on the screen, but this is paragraph 19 of your statement, which is in the witness statement bundle, volume 3 at page 63. You say there that the board, however, reviewed the whole document again and produced further comments. This re-review occurred across the whole project, not just the environmental matrix. The board were effectively doing a further review of what they wanted post-financial close. Have you formed any view about why that was happening?
I have a number of different views, some from the time, some formed later, some perhaps influenced by things I've read in the last couple of weeks. I think initially the board had experienced difficulties on other projects and they wanted to have a thorough review of the information to make sure that lessons learned were incorporated and those same difficulties didn't come up again. I think that for a long time, the board were developing this hospital in a different environment and they had specific things that they wanted to make sure.
If we try and just summarise that, was it essentially a close control or close interest by the board in the details of the design? Was that the thrust of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think very close interest. And I think sometimes it felt like there was trying to be some control, certainly a lot of influence on the design.
And did you regard that as consistent with the contractual structure that was being used for this project?
Not entirely. However, there were certain points raised which were very beneficial because there were certain points raised of things where we perhaps off track from the BCRs and clients' requirements. There are other things raised where they had issues in the past and allowed us to go and look at the methodology we were delivering with and perhaps modify that. So it wasn't entirely negative. There's a lot of positives came out of it. But what we did do with the comments coming back is we started to classify them as to whether that was something that we have got wrong from the BCRs and we need to make the corrections, something that we felt was a change from the BCRs, or something that was purely an operational functionality aspect, or an aspect that we could alter with no time, cost, program implications at that point in the project. Okay. So we classified the return of the RDD, particularly architecturally, under those, and then we would go back and have another meeting with the board to say, okay, points 1 to 6, they're on us. Points 4 to 5, we can change. There's no real implication to us doing that, so we can alter these further points so we believe a change.
Yeah. Okay, so I think what you're describing there is the commercial implications of the number of comments that were coming back from the board. Is that?
Not necessarily just the commercial implications. I'm also describing the level of comments and the depth of review the board were doing.
Yeah. Which
was above our anticipated level of it being checked against comments from financial close.
Okay. Okay, in paragraphs 27 to 35 of your statement, you refer to the development of the environmental matrix under the design review process. And my attempt at summarising what you're saying is that you describe a process in which the approval status of the environmental matrix fluctuated between approved and unapproved by the health board. But you also make the point that throughout that process, NHSL didn't make any adverse comments about the 4 air change per hour parameter for the rooms in critical care. Now, the precise contractual consequences of that are ultimately a matter for legal submissions, but I'm interested in your understanding of the position. What was the significance, as you saw it, of NHSL approving the matrix without taking particular issue with the critical care air change rates?
From approval of the matrix, which was subject to RDD, so from approval of anything within RDD, that is the point at which we would go into full manufacturer and full construction of everything that's getting installed into the hospital. So that approval process and that RDD process is highly significant, because that in effect starts the wheels turning of everything that's then going to happen beyond and ultimately be constructed.
And in the particular case of the air change parameters that hadn't been commented upon, were you taking the lack of comment from NHSL as effectively confirming that those air change rates were what the health board wanted?
Yes.
If we could have on screen, please, Bundle 13, Volume 1, page 7. Can you see that on screen, Mr Pike?
I can, yes.
Yep. So this is an email from the midst of that review process of the matrix. And we can see that it's an email from Mott MacDonald dated the 17th of October 2016 to various recipients, and you're one of the copy recipients. And the subject heading is RDD Review Environmental Matrix. And what the sender says is that the board have reviewed the environmental matrix and still has significant concerns on items that do not appear to comply with the BCRs. And then there's a list of what are headed up as general comments. And then further down the page, there's a longer list of what are headed up as some specific comments. And if we go on to the next page, please. The email signs off with the following. Whilst the board has noted general and specific comments above, the board reminds Project Co that unless the board has already accepted a derogation, it is Project Co's obligation to comply with the BCRs, SHTMs, etc. And the board not commenting does not remove that obligation on Project Co. What point did you understand Mott MacDonald to be making?
That in case they had not necessarily spotted something, it wasn't their responsibility.
And that would include something like a non-compliance with guidance?
It could do, yes.
If compliance with the guidance was a requirement of the board's construction requirements?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And what was your reaction to comments of that nature from Mott MacDonald?
They're not particularly unusual comments with any of the projects I've been in. It's not an unstandard rider that might come across on the review.
Sorry, could you just give me that again, Ms?
That particular comment noted at the bottom of the email is not uncommon to receive back on any of the project.
Not uncommon to
Yeah.
receive. Thank you.
Did you see it as an attempt by the Health Board and Mott MacDonald to get Project Co to go through the environmental matrix and check it for compliance, for example, with guidance?
No, I didn't see it as that. I saw it more as an iteration by NHSL and Mott MacDonald of their understanding of the contractual position.
So who did you understand to be responsible for ensuring that the ventilation parameters in the matrix were compliant with the board construction requirements?
I think it was our responsibility to follow through with the RDD matrix and that they were compliant with the board construction requirements.
And did that include parameters which had appeared in the version of the matrix at financial close?
I'm not entirely sure what those parameters are, but
well,
I would say so.
If we take the parameters of 4 air changes per hour in the critical care rooms,
yes,
So when you say yes, you mean that Project Co were responsible through the RDD process for ensuring that those parameters were compliant with the BCRs?
Yes.
Okay. And the same question, but in relation to compliance with SHTM 0301.
Sorry, yeah, SHTM 0301, as you'll be aware, is wide-ranging across full ventilation systems, not just air change rates. And I think it was our obligation to comply with SHTM 0301 unless specifically directed otherwise.
Okay. And in relation to the particular parameters stated in the matrix at financial close, did you regard yourself as having been told to do otherwise than comply with SHTM 0301?
We did, yes.
And in what respect?
The airflow rates in single bedrooms and in multi-bed wards being at 4 air changes an hour. And latterly, as a discussion on 4 beds, various pressure or notional pressure regimes that were in the systems.
Okay. So were you proceeding on the basis that in relation to those parameters, Project Co were entitled to proceed on the basis that NHSL had selected them and had themselves taken the risk of their compliance or otherwise with guidance?
I wasn't aware of necessarily any risk in compliance. I would look at it more along the lines of thinking that that had been a strategic decision with whatever good reason sitting behind it, done prior to our engagement in the project.
So if on going through the matrix, Project Co had seen parameters which jumped out as non-compliant with guidance, would you regard it as your responsibility to raise that with the client?
I think there was an obligation on us to raise items we saw as non-compliant to guidance. So that would read across into this.
Yeah. If you could go please to Bundle 13, Volume 1, page 12. And you should see that on the screen in front of you, Mr Pike. Again, it's an email from Mott MacDonald to Ken Hall and others. You're a copy recipient, 7th of November 2016. And Mott MacDonald say, the board has serious concerns over the upgrading environmental matrix to status B, considering some of the issues raised being the same as the issues that had been raised since financial close. There are also concerns over the potential inaccurate information being transferred to the room data sheets being submitted through RDD. And then he carries on. However, as requested by Project Co, the board has upgraded the environmental matrix to status B, noting that the board still does not believe the environmental matrix and resultant design complies with the project agreement. Project Co's failure to comply with the BCRs/PCPs, the board believes, would result in a non-compliant facility. The board would suggest that Project Co resolves the non-compliant other issues as a matter of urgency, and so on. Is it correct that Project Co had asked NHSL to approve the matrix to status B?
I think there was discussions at the time whereby the matrix relates to the entire hospital and has a major impact on the M&E systems throughout the hospital. There are areas of the hospital that were under construction from a frame perspective, where the M&E was now due to go into manufacture or start to be made, which were not affected by any of the comments that were being made at this time on the matrix. And therefore, we were looking for release of the hospital into production under M&E fabrication.
Yeah. And so at the same time as approving it, NHSL are maintaining in fairly strong terms that the design is non-compliant. Was that an uncomfortable state of affairs?
Not necessarily uncomfortable when taken in context of the comments being made against the matrix.
And do you mean, don't let me put words in your mouth, but do you mean that the comments made clear what the issues were?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd like to turn now briefly to the ventilation arrangements for the multi-bed rooms. And you deal with this topic in some detail in your statement. It's in paragraphs 36 to 70. And your account there refers to various documents. And that's available to the inquiry as part of your evidence, and I don't intend to go through it all. This is also a subject in relation to the design aspects that I intend to go through with Mr Hall and Mr McKechnie, who I think were probably closer to the design than you were. Is that
fair? Right, yeah.
Yeah. So in short, as I understand it, after financial close and in the course of developing the design, a proposal was made for a balanced pressure arrangement in the multi-bed rooms in the hospital. Is that correct?
Is this in part of the discussion around how the NHS wanted pressure regimes to work within the 4-bedded rooms?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the first question is, which party was it that suggested the multi-bed rooms should have balanced pressure?
I think that came from NHS and from some of the clinical groups within the NHS.
And what did you understand to be NHSL's reasons for seeking balanced pressure in those rooms?
I think following consultation with some of their clinical groups, there was relation to cohorting of patients into rooms, and their preference was for them to be a balanced or negative pressure to allow them to do that from an operational point of view.
And did you yourself know the reasons why a balanced pressure arrangement was better for that particular clinical use?
Not specifically, no.
And that cohorting arrangement, was that something that you were aware of at the time, or is it something that you've learned about subsequently?
It was something that came up in the discussions as to why elements were looking to alter from what was being progressed.
And what did you, as the multiplex project director, consider to be the commercial implication of that proposal?
I considered it to be a change from the contract of what we were providing.
And why did you consider it to be a change?
I think because the brief had asked for positive pressure in those areas.
And by brief, are you referring to the
BCRs and construction requirements?
And in particular to the environmental matrix?
Yeah. Well, I think also in here, you can look into SHTMO 301 again and have a debate about how that particular type of room should be classified as well. And we had taken a view on it being classified under a general ward arrangement, and others had a different view that it should be classified under a single bedroom arrangement. Yes.
And so those who took the view that it should be classified as a single bedroom, that was essentially NHSL.
Yeah.
And and Mott MacDonald too?
I don't know. I know that NHSL would have been talking to Mott MacDonald. I don't know Mott MacDonald's specific view on it.
But as far as you understood it, NHSL were classifying the multi-bedrooms as within the single room category in the SHTMO 301 guidance.
Yeah.
And you Multiplex and Wallace Whittle were classifying them as a general ward for the purposes of that guidance.
That's right.
Did NHSL's choice of classification have a bearing on the commercial implications of the proposal?
It did, yes, because it would flip the pressure regime predominantly into balanced and negative.
And so that would be something inconsistent with what was stated in the environmental matrix.
Yes.
And so what did NHSL see as the commercial implications of that?
I thought NHS's view at the time was that we were non-compliant with the PCRs and therefore we should make the change.
So if I could just expand on that, NHSL's position was that the environmental matrix was non-compliant with the guidance by specifying a positive pressure arrangement for the multi-bedrooms instead of the balanced pressure regime required by the guidance.
Sorry,
If that was a very long question.
Could you just say that again for me, please?
Yeah. So was it your understanding that NHSL regarded the environmental matrix as non-compliant with guidance in relation to the pressure arrangements it specified for multi-bedrooms?
That isn't something I had thought of previously, but, and forgive me a little bit, between balanced, negative, and it potentially could be read like that. Yeah. That isn't something I would thought of at the time.
Okay. Perhaps a simpler way to put it is, in asking for a balanced pressure arrangement in the multi-bedrooms, did NHSL consider that they were themselves asking for a change in the contract requirements?
No, they didn't.
Okay. In response to this suggestion, Wallace Whittle produced a proposal to achieve balanced pressure in the multi-bedrooms. And there are various versions of this, and I will look through more of them with Mr. Hall and Mr. McKechnie. But if I could go to one with you, if we could have Bundle 13, Volume 1, page 35, please. Now, do you recognise this document, Mr. Pike?
Yes.
If you look at the heading, first of all, the top right-hand corner, we see the TÜV Süd Wallace Whittle crest. So it's a document they produced. And the heading, General Ward Ventilation Amendment Proposal to Achieve Room Balance. So was this document produced in order to deal with the request to have balanced pressure in the multi-bedrooms?
Yes, it was.
And what we see, if we just look at that page and then ask the document controller to scroll down through the next couple of pages, what we see in the left-hand column is a list of rooms from A to S. So we just scroll down that, please. So we've got 20 rooms listed in this document. If we go back up to the first page, please, we see the fourth column headed up room description, and then below that, the room description for each of the rooms is multi-bedroom with four being the number of patients it was designed for. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So these 20 rooms, these are all multi-bedrooms in the RHCYP hospital, is that correct?
Yeah.
And if we look on that page, we see in the left-hand column, we've got D, E, and F. There are 3 rooms marked as D, E, and F. And if we read along into the room number column for those rows, D, E, and F, we see that each of those rooms has a particular reference with B1 in it. What does the B1 code denote?
B1 code denotes that those rooms are within the critical care department.
And if we go down to the third page, please. Oh, yes. Sorry, back up a page. Do we see there room M also has a B1 reference.
Yeah,
So is that room also in the critical care department?
that's what that would donate, yes.
Okay. And if we go back up to the first page, under the heading proposed solution, so the column which has the most text in it, and we could look at any of D, E and F, we see that the proposed solution involves reducing the supply ventilation down to 3 air changes per hour, and then reading on to the next sentence, this will achieve a balanced room pressure. So, in short, do we see that that's a proposal being made by Wallace Whittle for the achievement of balanced room pressure in all of these rooms?
Yeah.
Then at the right-hand side of the table, we've got a column headed up severity of works, and another one headed up ductwork fabricated. Why are these columns there?
So there's, with most of these things, there's a couple of parts in terms of this aspect. So between us and NHSL and the project team, we recognise that clinical function needs to come at the top of the considerations. And at this point in time, it was identified that these rooms were not going to serve the clinical function that the NHSL required. So putting to the side the commercial implications, we both undertook that we would go away and look at the rooms in question. Wallace Whittle would do an overall design which would achieve a balanced position. The NHS would look at whether it was or wasn't essential for them to have that room under a clinical need, and we would look at what has already happened, what's already built, and how difficult undertaking any operations to those systems would be. So the right-hand columns are our columns in terms of, has the ductwork been made, yes or no? And then how severe and disruptive would the works be to make alterations to suit this Wallace Whittle proposal?
Okay. And then we also see handwritten on the document the word essential. And if we scroll down through it, we'll see that other ones are marked as non-essential. So yeah, on the third page, those ones are marked as not essential. And again, what does that denote?
That was the NHS having an internal review into which rooms they absolutely needed balanced to negative pressure and which ones where it was not essential to have balanced or negative pressure.
And why was it necessary for them to consider which rooms for which it was essential and which it was not essential?
Whilst we had parked necessarily whose liability this was, while we got to a technical solution, ultimately there was going to be disruption onto the construction and ultimate completion of the project through these works. So it was probably acting in everybody's interest to only alter the systems that required to be altered, essentially.
Okay, so whilst you were working towards a technical solution, everybody recognised that behind it was a commercial debate about who was going to carry the cost of that.
Yeah.
Okay, if we could close that document down, please, and go to Bundle 13, Volume 1, page 792. I'm jumping forward in time here, missing out a few steps, but what we see here is a later version of the same document. I think from the version box in the bottom left-hand corner, I think this is version 7. Yeah, we can just about read version 7. And if we scroll back out and go down a few pages, we scroll down, I think, 2 or 3 pages. Yeah, one more, please. What we see there is the RDD stamp from Janice McKenzie of NHS Lothian, dated the 26th of July 2018, approving that proposal at level A. So that's essentially approval of the technical solution which had been under discussion between the parties.
Yeah.
And if we go back up and we look at the solution as drafted for rooms D, E and F. So D, E and F, again, just to point out, are the B1 code rooms in critical care. And the solution described there is retain the supply ventilation at 4 air changes per hour, and then reading on, this will achieve a balanced room pressure. So do we see there the technical solution that was agreed for these rooms?
Yes.
At any point in the process leading up to this approval, so far as you are aware, was there any consideration by anyone to the possibility that these rooms in the critical care department were subject to the recommendation in SHTM 0301 for critical care areas of 10 air changes per hour and a 10 pascals positive pressure arrangement?
I can't speak for everybody else. I was never made aware of that through any party. I would say from myself, I was reading it back to what I considered to be the contract. So I was reading it back to the 4 air changes and not seeing any cause for concern there.
Okay, so when you're obviously aware that the main function of this proposal was to change the pressure arrangement for these rooms.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah. And the solution for that involves 4 air changes per hour. And so are you saying that you would compare that to the environmental matrix?
Yeah.
And see written in there the 4 air change per hour parameter?
Yeah.
And thereby be comforted that there wasn't a change being made in relation to the air changes?
Yes.
But you'd be aware that there was a change in the pressure arrangement,
Yeah.
as the matrix said, positive pressure for these rooms.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you explain in your statement that works in accordance with that solution were then carried out and the ventilation systems commissioned in around October 2018. So just to be clear about that, can we take it that the ventilation works in critical care were complete by October 2018?
I pretty much believe that, yeah.
And up on screen, we've got there the approval of the technical solution in July 2018. When were the commercial implications of this agreed?
They were not finalised until the settlement agreement was signed in February 19.
February 2019?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a few months after the ventilation systems were commissioned.
Yeah.
Yeah. If we could go please to bundle 13, volume 1, page 798. Is this a document that you recognise, Mr Pike?
Yes.
And can you just tell us what that is, please?
That's the technical schedule that's associated to settlement agreement 1.
Okay. And we see there 2 items on screen, but was it the case that the technical schedule set out dozens of solutions to particular disputes that had arisen?
Yeah. I wouldn't necessarily class them all as disputes either. Legal talk disputes, yes, but differences of opinion.
Differences of opinion, okay. But they were resolved in technical terms by settlement agreement 1?
Yes.
And if we could go to page 802, please. And we see there item 7 headed up 4-bed ventilation. And everyone will be delighted to know that I'm not going to read all of that out, but does that effectively record the technical solution that we saw approved on the Wallace-Whittle document a few moments ago?
Yes.
And then if we go forward, please, to page 805. And unfortunately, we're straddling 2 pages here. If it's possible to get this and the following page on screen at the same time, that would be great. Oh, we can't do that, I'm told, so we'll start here. So you see at the bottom, item 13, single bedroom ventilation changes.
Yeah.
And then the solution reads, the board project co-agree this item is closed and the agreed technical solution approved through the review procedure and agreed by the board and project co as resolving the dispute is as set out in disputed work schedule appendix 1, item 13. And if we could go please to page 797. We see here disputed work schedule appendix 1, item 13, title single bedroom ventilation. Is that the document referred to in the technical schedule as the solution to the issue in the single bedrooms?
I believe so, yes.
And if we just read from that, it's headed up single bedroom ventilation, detail of change, table A1 of appendix 1, recommended air change rates of SHTM 0301 and so on, indicates that single rooms should be provided with 6 air changes per hour and 0 or negative pressure, single room WC and so on. And then it says Project Co proposes to decrease the mechanical air change ventilation rate within single bedrooms from 6 air changes per hour to 4 air changes per hour, and then a change for the single bedroom WCs. And the reason given is that Project Co's design philosophy for bedroom ventilation is based on mixed mode operation, where mechanical supply ventilation providing 4 air changes per hour is then supplemented by openable windows to provide a passive means of ventilation where access to an openable window is available. So this applies to rooms for which the SHTM recommendation is 6 air changes per hour, is that correct?
Not necessarily. I think this applies to the rooms that were single bedrooms within the context of the design brief.
Okay. It starts off by talking about the recommendation in SHTM 0301 for 6 air changes per hour.
Mm-hmm.
It explains the mixed mode ventilation philosophy, providing 4 air changes per hour, and seeks effectively a derogation from 6 air changes to 4 air changes. So is that not an indication that this only applies to rooms for which the SHTM recommendation is 6 air changes per hour?
It could be read that way, yes. I think where I would go back to here was these rooms were always at 4 air changes from the outset in terms of through the matrix and everything else. So when we were looking at this particular change request, it was written with joint wording between ourselves, Mark MacDonald and NHSL as part of the agreed protocol to the settlement agreement, and not necessarily, certainly from my perspective, paying strict attention to what the origin of these rooms may be.
Okay, I think I see that. So, well, if we could do it this way, if we could go to, sorry, just before we leave that document, that proposal relates to rooms which have WCs and openable windows. Is that right?
Yeah.
And did the single rooms in critical care have WCs and openable windows?
I don't believe so. I think there may have been a time where there were openable windows in that department, but that was subsequently removed by either sealing the window or locking the window.
I mean, by the time this document was drafted, had the WCs and openable windows been removed?
Sorry, the WCs were never in question, just the openable windows part. I couldn't actually tell you from the timing perspective.
Okay. If we could go please to bundle 2, page 70. You should see on screen there, Mr Pike, at the bottom, an email from Matthew Templeton of Dalmore Capital to you on the subject of single bedrooms, and it's dated the 3rd of July 2019. So this is around the time that people are becoming aware of IOM's report about the air changes in critical care. And Mr Templeton says, Darren, with regards to critical care, single bedrooms and air change rates, to what extent is that affected by item 13 in the disputed work schedule of the settlement agreement? This debated whether single rooms should be 6 air changes per hour versus 4 air changes per hour. However, it was decided upon 4 with an increased extract through the ensuite. And then he comes to his question. When this item 13 was discussed and agreed, was the intention it also covered critical care single beds, or are these covered under a different part of the SHTM and hence not covered under the settlement agreement? And you reply and say, Matt, reading that through, it would apply to all single bedrooms. I'm checking the SHTMs for specifics around HDU critical care. Be interested if you and Pinson's read it the same way. So it would appear that at least at that time, you weren't going on anything more than the wording of Settlement Agreement 1 to reach the conclusion that that ventilation solution applied to the rooms in critical care. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. Have you subsequently become aware of any discussion or correspondence to indicate explicit agreement by NHSL that the 4 air change arrangement for single rooms was to apply to critical care rooms?
I haven't come across that from NHSL, no.
And I'm just going to return to an explanation that you gave earlier, just out of fairness to you. I think what you said was your understanding that the proposal related to all of the single rooms in the hospital came from the fact that the environmental matrix had always specified 4 air changes per hour for those rooms. Is that fair? Yeah. Please don't let me put words in your mouth.
No, that is how I was reading it at the time, yeah.
Yeah. If I could turn now to a question about the commercial considerations surrounding Settlement Agreement 1. As we've seen, it documented all of these technical solutions. And once it was signed, practical completion of the building was certified. Is that correct?
Yes.
Almost exactly the same time, actually, as the settlement agreement was signed. But the nature of Settlement Agreement 1 was such that some work was yet to be completed at the hospital. Is that correct?
Yes.
And one question which arises is why NHSL were content to do that. I mean, one implication, as we understand it, is that the independent validation of the ventilation systems couldn't take place at that time and had to take place later because the ongoing building work would have stopped it being done. Is that your understanding?
Yeah. Well, a few points to cover here potentially. I'll maybe come back to the validation, so prompt me if I don't.
Okay.
So as we were going through the latter part of 2018 into 2019, there was an attempt to get the hospital completed and opened prior to the busy Christmas period for NHSL, which ultimately proved impossible to quite get there. So between the period of October into through the winter time, there was very little construction work really going off at the hospital. It was a little bit of change, a little bit of our works tidying up and some NHSL contractor works, but predominantly the focus was on the settlement agreement and getting, if you like, the commercial aspect of all the technical stuff that we'd agreed before and predominantly completed, the building of, agreed and signed up. Part of that process involved pulling together a joint completion program, which would have everybody's activities on it Multiplex's activities, NHSL's activities, Boyg's activities, and any other party that had works to do within the hospital, such that they could all be coordinated and aligned to get to the best possible opening date for the hospital, which is always a few months after we would finish construction anyway. In that, we had been requested to do quite a number of changes by the board. We had some further works to do, which were under a kind of semi-disputed works schedule, not necessarily as clear-cut as some of the SA1 original parts to do. And the agreement was made that the change works, the post-completion works, as they became known, our snagging and any defect rectification works, the NHS's contractor, and migration works would all occur along a path. That joint completion.
Sorry, Mr Pike, my fault. You were talking about post-completion works.
Yeah.
I just didn't hear what you said after that.
I think I said post-completion works, any snagging or defect rectification works of ours, Boygs would start to mobilise to take over systems, and NHSL had their own contractors and their own fit-out specialists in, including people like the artwork and things like that being done, but also part of the major machinery and hospital operating equipment. So that joint completion programme, which was very well put together in collaboration from all parties, clearly showed what activities were going to happen when throughout the course of 2019 up to opening. So I was a little bit surprised in some of the statements I read saying they couldn't do an activity at a specific time because construction works were ongoing, because I thought it was fairly well known through all. And the construction works ongoing were not necessarily the contracted works. However, I would make a point saying there were some contracted works which were asked to be delayed to as late as possible. For example, the knocking through of the link bridge into the existing ERI, where it was desirable not to have that open until right before opening of the hospital. So by accommodation of that, we couldn't finish our contract work, strictly speaking, until that bit was done. And I think all parties thought it reasonable to allow that piece to go past the issue of practical completion and then be reviewed at a later point in time. So with that, the validation aspect was always going to be fairly late on in that process. And then just also, and it's possibly slightly more of a side from my experience in other projects, particularly around theatre validation, it's been my experience that is typically done pretty close to the theatres going operational, because people would like to get the validation done not too far in advance of operating the theatre, so they know that it's current and everything is absolutely perfect at the moment of putting them into use. Obviously, in considering that, there's always a buffer left in case you find any issues that you can attend to any issues as well.
Okay, there's a lot in that answer, so thank you. You talked there about the programming of everybody's activities with the objective of opening the hospital as soon as possible. What did you understand, or did you understand that for practical completion to be certified would help in the programming of those activities? What I'm trying to get to the bottom of is why practical completion was certified when it was.
I think because in the main, the contract works were actually finished. The actual original contract was pretty much finished, with the exception of the as late as possible works, snagging defects, which would come post-contract anyway, and 3 other disputed items which came into the fore in mid to late 2018.
Okay.
So in terms of, again, probably more experience across the piece, is when practical completion was issued, judging it purely against the original contract, I would say that that was a fair point to issue it.
Okay. The inquiry has received some evidence about NHSL's decision-making on this issue from Susan Goldsmith, who was the NHSL finance director at the time. Have you had an opportunity to, and there's no particular reason why you would have done, but have you had an opportunity to read her statement?
Yes.
You have, okay. So if we could go to witness statement bundle 1, please. At page 425, first of all. So we can see here that we're reading from the witness statement to the inquiry of Susan Goldsmith. Then if we go forward to page 435, please. And it's paragraph 32 of Mrs. Goldsmith's statement. And I'm just going to read some passages from this, Mr. Pike, and then ask you some questions about it. So in paragraph 32, about five or six lines up from the end, she says, in short, Settlement Agreement 1 provided financial support for IHSL who were facing financial distress, without which they may not have been able to complete the hospital. And then she says, I've copied over paragraphs 6.8 to 6.15 from the board position paper below and adopt them as part of my evidence because they did and do reflect my understanding and answer the questions I have been asked. And then in 6.8, she says that in January 2017, IHSL notified the board they'd be unable to complete by the contracted date of July 2017. At the same time, she says, IHSL also indicated to the board that Multiplex had suffered significant losses on the project. And then if we go on to the next page at 6.10, she says, under the terms of the contract, IHSL would not begin to receive payment for the new facility until it was available to the board. Therefore, at this time, IHSL had no income with which to service their debt obligations to their senior lenders. Under the terms of IHSL's contract with Multiplex, IHSL could seek damages from Multiplex to replace the lost income that would allow debt service payments to commence and avoid a default under the terms of the loans with their senior lenders. However, while the process of agreeing the settlement agreement was taking place, the board became aware that as well as the losses Multiplex was facing on the project, they had not been paying damages to IHSL. And then she carries on, as a consequence, IHSL faced financial distress and insolvency. If IHSL became insolvent, they would be in default of the contract, which may have led to their termination, leaving the board to then complete the facility or to find another party willing to take over the contract. However, prior to the board being in a position to exercise any termination rights under the project agreement, the board are obliged under the terms of a direct agreement with IHSL senior lenders to give them prior notice of an intention to exercise the termination rights. Following the service of such a notice, senior lenders have extensive rights to step in and seek to resolve the default. This scenario, or any alternative approach such as court action, would have resulted in a timescale for completion of the facility that would have been completely unknown. Further, even if the board were in a position to pursue termination under the terms of the project documents, the facility would only revert to NHS following agreement or determination of the applicable compensation payable to IHSL / senior lenders. The compensation would likely have been in excess of £150 million, a sum that would have had to be funded from the Scottish Government's capital programme. Avoiding this scenario became a key driver of the settlement agreement and the quantification of the settlement sum it entailed. And then down to the next page at 6.14, it's just at the end of that, she says, to further preserve IHSL's financial stability and to introduce a higher degree of certainty over completion timescale, the board agreed that their own commissioning programme to facilitate commencement of clinical services would run concurrently with the remaining works. And so that last point is one of the ones that you were adverting to. So in short, Mrs. Goldsmith's understanding appears to have been that Settlement Agreement 1 was needed when it was to alleviate the risk of financial collapse on the part of IHSL. Do you agree that that's an accurate assessment of the position?
I couldn't comment straightforward on IHSL's financial stability at that time. It was not something I was privy to. I would have been aware that all parties involved are under a form of commercial strain. It may have been a reason. I couldn't dispute that it was or wasn't, but I would also say the completion of the facility to the original contract was also a reason.
I mean,
not for SA1, but for issuing of completion.
Yeah. And in terms of the broader explanation of the financial position that Mrs. Goldsmith gave, is there anything in that you take issue with as being inaccurate?
Could you just run us back to the first couple of paragraphs, please?
So that'd be page 436 of the bundle.
Yeah, so I don't think there's anything I specifically take issue to. We multiplex paid damages for a long period of time. We paid damages for a period of time that we felt was commensurate with the area of delay that was our responsibility entirely.
So just pause there. Those were damages paid to IHSL.
Yeah, but there was a point of time that we came to where the delays ongoing, we did not feel were entirely our responsibility. But in terms of disagreement, I can't disagree because I didn't have the inside knowledge that Susan had on a number of those points.
Okay. If I could, well, I was going to go on to another topic, but I noticed, my lord, the time, and it's 28 minutes past 11. Your lordship may prefer to have the break just now. I have a few more questions for Mr Pike, which wouldn't be finished before 11:30.
Well, I can see if you have a few more questions, 11:30 might be a bit of an ask. If this seems to you a good point to break, I'm happy to do so. Ms. Pike, as I said, we take a coffee break. We'll try and be back about 11:45.
Okay,
Thank you.
sure.
Ms. Pike. Mr McLaren.
Thank you, my lord. Mr Pike, I'd like now to turn to some correspondence that was issued at the start of 2019. And this is a topic that you address in your statement, paragraph 71 to 79. Just to put it into its context, if we could have the document at bundle 13, volume 1, page 762, please. If we could scroll out a little bit just so we can see the whole letter. That's perfect, thank you. Do you see there, Mr Pike, a letter from Paul Gray, the Director General of Health and Social Care and Chief Executive of NHS Scotland? It's a letter to NHS Chief Executives dated 25th of January 2019, and it's headed up, Dear colleague, Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, follow-up actions. And he says, there are a number of controls I would like you to confirm are in place and working effectively. And the fourth bullet point is all critical ventilation systems inspected and maintained in line with SHTM 0301 and so on. Now this letter, I think, made its way to you and led to you drafting correspondence on behalf of Multiplex, bearing upon the extent to which the ventilation systems in the RHCYP complied with that guidance. Is that correct?
Yes.
And if we go down, please, to page 766. Do we see there the letter that you drafted, essentially in response to that letter that we saw a moment ago?
Yes.
And it's dated the 31st of January 2019, and it's from Multiplex to IHS Lothian Limited. The subject is reprovision of RHSC and DCN at Little France, plant rooms and ventilation systems.
Yeah.
And it says, with reference to your letter, and you're referring here to a letter from IHSL, we can confirm the following. Then the fourth bullet, all ventilation systems have been designed, installed and commissioned in line with SHTM 0301, and so on. What was the basis for your statement there that all the ventilation systems had been designed, installed and commissioned in line with SHTM 0301?
Just probably a question. I don't know if you're going to go to the letter previous to this one that was issued and then superseded.
So I think that's page 764.
Yeah.
Is that the letter you were referring to?
Just because this was the original letter sent, which we then superseded with the one you had on the screen a moment ago. All ventilation systems designed, installed and commissioned in line with SHTM 0301 as required, and then the full stop. You'll see in the first letter you put up, the second letter that went out, that full stop had been dropped from the letter and changes the way that paragraph reads quite a little bit.
Okay.
Unintentionally.
Okay.
But I can see where that would come from.
Okay, so if we look at the one that's on screen, the confirmation given in the fourth bullet point is that all ventilation systems have been designed, installed and commissioned in line with SHTM 0301 as required. And then if we look at the other one on page 706, so yeah, we see there that additional words now appear at the end of that paragraph. And what was the point you were making, Mr. Pike?
So really should be a full stop still after as required in that first part. So then to answer, I think answering your question, but please let me know if I don't. I meant by that as far as we were aware and concerned, all of this ventilation systems had been designed, installed and commissioned in line with SHTM 0301 as required in the context of the contract. And then start a new sentence, systems are maintained in such a manner which allows handover at actual completion to meet SHTM 0301. The addition of that second sentence or additional wording in this context was more to make this letter actually address the point in the original letter that came into IHSL regarding QEUH, which was specific to maintenance in itself.
All right. So for present purposes, the bit that I'm interested in is the first bit. So up to where the full stop was, the confirmation that the systems had been designed, installed and commissioned in line with SHTM 0301 as required. Now, I think what you said a moment ago, and this is what you say in your statement, that what you meant by those words as required was except to the extent that the board had stated a different requirement. Is that what you meant by that?
An extension of it, yeah. As I believe to be required under the contract.
Okay. But do you accept that the letter as sent doesn't actually say that?
It certainly be read differently with that grammatical error in it, yeah.
Yeah. Certainly your letter gives no indication of any departure from FHTM guidance.
It doesn't give any indication of departure from that guidance. No, answering the question, I think we were asked, focusing on maintenance in particular. That was probably the predominant thought in my head at that point, at that moment.
The letter that we saw issued by the Chief Executive of NHS Scotland, did you understand that to have been prompted by concerns which had arisen at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Glasgow?
Yes.
And did you understand the government to be looking for reassurance that other hospitals were being built entirely in compliance with guidance?
Not from that letter, no. I think what I understood from that letter was they were looking for assurance that systems have been maintained in alignment with the guidance.
Okay. But you understood that, at least in general terms, the government was interested in reassurance that guidance was being complied with?
Yes. But again, I would say from that letter, the specifics were around maintenance. And I think a particular issue that had arisen at QEUH with a potential for maintenance or plant areas not to have been in a particular way.
At the time you drafted the letter, did you understand that the contract requirements did in fact depart from SHTM guidance?
It's a good question. I had never specifically picked up the critical care element versus the SHTM, so I hadn't personally picked that up. And this is January 19, so I would think at that point I had not made that connection.
So are you referring specifically there to the matter of 10-year changes in critical care?
Yeah.
You yourself were not aware at that time that 4-year changes would be a departure from the SHTM recommendation?
It wasn't something I was conscious of at that time, yeah.
What about the derogation from 6-year changes to 4-year changes that had been agreed?
I was aware of that, yeah. And sorry, I'm just going to ask if you don't mind, just the context of what question in that. Was I aware that that derogated from SHTM 301?
Yeah, so at the time you sent this letter, were you aware that there had been a derogation from SHTM guidance?
Yeah, I was.
At least to the extent.
I was on that, and I suppose to a way that is where the as required part of that statement comes in.
Okay. In the context of the government looking for reassurance about compliance with guidance, would you accept in hindsight it would have been better to say explicitly that the ventilation had derogated from the guidance at least to that extent?
In reply to the letter that we received for this, no, not necessarily, because it wasn't addressing that point.
So you,
So I suppose I would have been answering out of context to the question.
so the question posed in the letter from the Chief Executive of NHS Scotland was concerned with maintenance, essentially.
Yeah.
But your letter that's up on screen in front of us just now does explicitly address the question of design and installation. And so having gone to the extent of offering reassurance about the compliance of design and installation with the guidance, would it not have been better to be explicit that there had been a derogation, at least in relation to 6 down to 4 air changes?
I think, would it have been better to bring that one specific one forward than maybe further underlying ones that I was also not aware of at that time? I was answering the letter to give best level of comfort I could at that time with my understanding of the position.
Had you made inquiries of anybody else about the extent to which the design and installation complied with the guidance?
In terms of prior to sending this letter, I would have spoken to my M&E team. I don't think I would have specifically spoken to Wallace Whittle at that time, because again, I would have gone down the line more of the maintenance of the systems to make sure that we had done those in alignment with the guidance. However, I'm looking at the date of the 31st of January and appreciating completion was granted in the middle of February. This might be something that comes into later on anyway. We would have ascertained from our designers as part of the completion handover pack that effectively a letter of conformity and comfort from themselves, which might be the next letter you're coming on to, and their systems being designed to meet the BCRs. So if I wasn't in possession of that letter from Wallace Whittle at that time, it would have certainly been something that we'd have discussed with Wallace Whittle, and I had that knowledge.
I mean, so we're looking at this letter at the end of January. Before sending that, I think you said that you'd have spoken to your M&E team.
Yeah.
I mean, would you have understood them to have checked the position with Wallace Whittle, or
no,
were you happy to rely on what your M&E team thought themselves?
In terms of designed installed position, I don't think I was asking the M&E team again. I wasn't questioning them on that. I think in our minds we were long past that point by then. It would have been more along the commissioning and maintenance side that I was asking them.
And then if we go, please, to page 769. This is the 12th of February 2019, so a couple of weeks after the letter we just looked at. And this is from IHS Lothian to Multiplex for your attention. And the letter reads, "Dear Sirs, re-provision of RHSC and so on at Little France. We would be grateful if you could provide your written assurance. 1, the engineering systems have been designed and are being installed and commissioned to meet current guidance and statutory requirements." And then if we look down at the bottom, we see engineering systems include, and then number 4, ventilation, including specialised ventilation in isolation rooms, theatres, and so on. And then if we go to page 771, please. Is this the letter that you drafted in response to the one we saw just a moment ago?
Yes.
So this is dated the 6th of March 2019, same heading. "Dear Sirs, further to your letter dated the 12th of February 2019, requesting our written assurances, we can confirm the following. The engineering systems are designed and have/are being installed and commissioned to meet the relevant construction contract standards as varied by the settlement agreement." Now, if we just compare that answer to the question, the question was about whether the systems had been designed and installed and commissioned to meet current guidance and statutory requirements? And the answer is that they've been designed, installed and commissioned to meet the contract standards. So we can see that you don't really quite answer the question that you were asked. And the question is, why not?
I think that all of our works and engagement is under the contract standards, or under the construction contract. And therefore our obligation is to meet that. And within that construction contract, there are a large variety of applicable standards and guidance and various other documentation to comply with. However, overarching obligation on us is to comply with a construction contract.
Was there any recognition in your mind at this stage that the contractual solution might not in all respects comply with the guidance?
I was fundamentally aware of the settlement agreement, and I knew within the settlement agreement there were various points and provisions that different people would have different interpretations on whether it did or didn't meet the guidance and what aspect it did or didn't meet the guidance through the discussions and negotiations in getting to that settlement agreement. Mm-hmm. So therefore I felt it was important to point out that the settlement agreement could vary some of those positions. So
is it fair to put it this way? You gave the assurance that you felt able to give?
Yeah.
And does it also follow that you didn't feel comfortable just giving a straight assurance that all guidance was complied with?
Yes.
Excuse me. I'd like now to go past practical completion up to the time in June and July 2019 when NHSL engaged IOM to carry out an independent validation of the ventilation systems. And at paragraph 104 of your statement, you quote from IOM's issues log produced at that time. And in short, IOM appear to have straight away identified that the critical care rooms were supposed to have 10 air changes per hour, and that in achieving 3 or 4, they were falling well short of what was required. What was your reaction on hearing of that report?
Specific to critical care or around IOM in general?
Critical care, please.
I think initially I was a little bit surprised. I didn't have all the information when I first heard about it. I was contacted to say IOM have raised some issues. There's some discrepancies between what they are measuring and what we have recorded. I was like, okay, that's not always that unusual. There are quite often a number of smaller items that come up during a validation that just require a little bit of attention or tweaking or rebalancing, and it settles it. So my first thought on hearing about it was, okay, what's the scale of it? How far away are the differences, and what is it they think they've found? It was then later on the return of that phone call that they were measuring against the 10 air changes an hour against the baseline of their interpretation of the SHTM. And I knew right away we were not going to be close to that number. So I knew that was going to be a big problem. And I was like, oof. Pretty disappointed and worried, I think, overall. However, I then realised that actually standard process would be for them to measure against what they considered to be the standard. And they would do all of their initial testing and results against what they consider to be the standard. That would then be relayed against any delegations or any contract requirements which might be different, and then they would be given guidance, normally from NHSL, that I'll take that room as an example, just thinking whether actually no, we've agreed for. So is it meeting 4? Yes, it is. Okay, that's acceptable, and people would know the difference they've got between potentially a guidance and an actual recorded figure. So that was where my thoughts went next to, okay, once they've finished this exercise, they'll be referred back to delegations, environmental matrix SA1, and it should be okay. And I checked with, I think I just checked very briefly that we are reaching the parameters we thought we were building to, which I was told we were. So I'm like, all right. And I can't quite remember the exact timescale then between that point and later, but it very quickly became apparent that no, that wasn't going to happen. The NHS were expecting the 10 air changes as well. And at that point, I appreciated that was a pretty big difference and was going to be a pretty big issue to resolve.
Yep. Okay. Did you agree or disagree that SHTM required 10 air changes per hour for these rooms?
I think it's a personal opinion. I've seen different interpretations of it throughout my career, and not just in critical care, across a variety of applied air change rates across various areas, and it has not been uncommon throughout my career for ventilation rates to be lower than with an A1 in specific schemes.
And just if we divert slightly into that topic, is that typically on the basis of a derogation or not?
It can be a derogation, it can be a client's brief.
Sorry, it can be derogation, can be...
A client's brief, but it is usually always, in fact, I think in every other experience I have of it, it is agreed from the outset of the project. It's not a derogation midstream, i.e. we've designed this system and it's not doing 6 air changes, it can only do 4, is that okay? It's never been that way around. It's always been agreed in and amongst the design principles that the air change rate would be utilised.
In answering that, sorry, Mr. McLennan, in answering that question, are you thinking specifically about the specification of critical care, or are you thinking of other instances?
Other instances.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you yourself have experience of a critical care department in a Scottish hospital being built with less than 10 air changes since SHTM 0301 came into force?
I don't think so on the air changes. I was thinking back and it was from memory rather than absolute proof. I don't think so in the air changes. However, I would say there were definitely areas within a critical care area that were not 10 air changes, but if I applied that specifically to bedrooms and accommodation, I think there have been 10 air changes, but they haven't necessarily been 10 pascals positive.
Okay.
Well, then, back to kind of where we started in terms of the area, there were certainly rooms like waiting areas and things that were not 10 air changes within that department.
Yeah. If we take ourselves back to this time when IOM make their discovery and report upon it, was there any, and you say that you were expecting the matter to be resolved once the contract requirements were looked at, but that didn't happen. Was there any discussion or debate at the time about whether or not IOM were correct to consider SHTM guidance required 10 air changes for these rooms?
I think there was a little discussion, not extensive discussion, but there was a little discussion, yes. And I think NHS sought internal counsel on that as well. I think we questioned the requirement to them, but it was not an extensive debate.
Is that because the possibility of a different interpretation was proposed but then rejected by everybody, or for some other reason?
I think it was proposed briefly, rejected fairly quickly, but the overarching aspect that everybody had and one everybody had right there was to get the hospital open. So the debates around what was an interpretation of standard, what did meet the standard, they were all kind of long gone, and everybody's focus was on getting to a safe operational hospital.
Okay.
And being very conscious that at that point in time, the migration date was getting pretty close.
If we could have document the Bundle 7, Volume 1, page 308, please. This is an email from Stuart McKechnie to various people, including you, the 11th of July 2019, so just over a week after IOM report what they regard as shortcomings.
Thank you.
I mean, do you remember or recognise that email, Mr Pike?
Yes, I do, yeah.
Yeah, I won't go through all of it, but in short, it's a sort of a fairly robust review by Mr McKechnie, and in short, he essentially maintains or sets out there the position that he maintains even now, that the critical care ventilation was both designed in accordance with the brief, and that there was nothing in the guidance to require 10 air changes and 10 pascals of positive pressure in the critical care rooms. Were you aware that that was Mr McKechnie's view?
I was at this point in time, yeah.
So far as you know, was Mr McKechnie's view communicated further up the chain, so for example to the Health Board or to the Scottish Government?
It was brought up in the early meetings around the IOM findings.
And in what context and what was the response to it?
The context being at the meetings, I think Stuart made the point that he felt his design did comply, and they didn't agree there was a non-compliance with SHGM 0301. However, I think at that time it was only given short airtime. I possibly need to step back a little bit on the chronological order into some of the SA1 just to explain our position and thought process at that point. So during the SA1, we had took the position that we could argue backwards and forwards for a long time about whether we were or weren't meeting the brief or were and weren't meeting the standards across the variety of issues. And we came to the conclusion that actually the best way forward and to conclusion of the project was to give the Health Board what they wanted across all of the aspects within the confines of what we had built being possible, or what the changes were, and an appreciation of those changes coming through. And that mindset continued through into this aspect. So as soon as it became, I would say apparent, but as soon as it became to us, the Health Board saying that we must have 10 air changes, we were just, right, okay, can we get you what you need? We were not looking to have contractual arguments. We were not going to sit there and say, well, our designers say this. We just went straight into a mode of, can we get you what you need? And to a large extent, Stuart's position, whilst not for me to argue the rights and wrongs as he's the designer, if that was not a position that the NHS felt comfortable to go forward and have a safe hospital, then we weren't going to pursue it.
Okay.
There's a question there. You asked me the question, was this raised to the Health Board? I only just clocked at the top that copy of that email is actually Stuart McKechnie to Ian Storer at NSS.
Yes. Yeah, so you're quite right. Thank you for pointing that out. So that's Mr Storer at NSS. So not the Health Board as such, but to Mr Storer. I mean, do you know if Mr McKechnie's viewpoint was considered by NSS?
I don't know.
If we could go to Witness Bundle, Volume 3, page 82, please. Now, this is your statement, Mr Pike, and we just refer to paragraph 118. And what you say is that on the 4th of July, you're talking about the 4th of July, and then you say the same day the Scottish Health Secretary announced that the opening of the hospital was being postponed due to final safety checks. which revealed that the ventilation system within the critical care department of the new hospital requires further works to meet national standards. Now, that statement that she made, that these works were required to meet national standards, did you agree or disagree with that?
I think there were parts I disagreed with at the time. However, it wasn't my jurisdiction to really make comment on that.
And the parts you disagreed with, what were they?
I think there was, to be honest, I was probably going into a realm that's not my realm, so I shouldn't go there. It was relating to where we were at with air changes and what were possible. We had been involved for a short time in terms of what I call a short-term solution and things like that. So, but ultimately, that's not where I'm qualified to comment.
Okay. But in short, if I could try and summarise what I've understood from your evidence, that Mr McKechnie's viewpoint that this remained a compliant design was put out there and discussed briefly, but the health board decided that what it wanted were 10 air changes per hour.
Yeah.
Okay, so standing back from all of that detail, Mr Pike, we have a situation in which the hospital was completed with a ventilation system in critical care, which NHSL and the Scottish Government, only a matter of months later, declared to be non-compliant with the guidance and had replaced. And that outcome happened despite extensive engagement amongst the health board and various professionals with expertise in the matter. What, in your view, caused that outcome?
What caused the decision not to open the hospital?
Well, what caused the situation in which everybody had been working together to produce a ventilation system, and then only a few months later, there's a decision that it's unacceptable?
I think the very root cause was back at the briefing stage, and then that follows its way through, right the way through the project. There are numerous people reviewing that information. There are people with knowledge reviewing that information. At no point did anyone spot it or see it sufficiently to raise a flag and at least get a discussion going on it. We know from what we've talked about today, there were various items on the matrix, there were various items across all of the technical solutions for the hospital that were questioned. And for some reason, that aspect on the decision to go with 4 from early on to the decision to put 4 forward and then design around 4 to commission to 4 did not at any point in time get recognised, registered, or even debated.
Okay, so by identifying the root cause, do you mean by that the inclusion of the 4 air change per hour parameter in the environmental matrix, or is there more to it than that?
No, I think that's the main point, specifically around the critical care ventilation part. The bidders, and my understanding only through reading the information that I've been sent, is the bidders responded to the matrix and were told to basically follow the matrix. One of the bidders did make alterations in that category or in that area. That was their decision, and they had spotted this piece and they raised it because they thought it needed to be raised in terms of air changes. The other 2 teams didn't, and then everything stems from that point onwards.
Mm-hmm. Are you aware of NHS guidance called SHFN 30 about the high scribe process?
Yeah, I have an awareness of it, yeah.
If we could go, please, to Bundle 13, Volume 3, page 464. So there we have the front page of it on screen. It's guidance issued by Health Facilities Scotland, and this is the October 2014 version. Now, the high scribe process in this guidance is essentially for health boards to help them manage infection risks arising from the healthcare built environment. And one of the things that it emphasises is the importance of collaboration amongst professionals if the risk of healthcare associated infection is to be managed effectively. If we could go please to page 470. And paragraph 1.3, I'm just going to read from that and the following paragraphs. This identifies the challenge as being that patients using healthcare facilities are more likely to be immunocompromised and also to receive intensive medical interventions, which in turn increase their vulnerability to opportunistic infections. Every effort must be taken to acknowledge and ultimately reduce these risks. And then 1.4, halfway through the paragraph, for healthcare associated infections to be reduced, it is imperative that infection prevention and control measures are designed in and IPC risks are designed out at the very outset of the planning and design stages of a healthcare facility, and the input continues up to, into and beyond the final building stage. Then 1.5, to achieve this, it is necessary that designers, architects, engineers, facilities managers and planners work in collaborative partnership with IPC teams, healthcare staff and the users to deliver facilities in which IPC needs have been anticipated, planned for and met. And whilst you weren't involved at the earliest briefing stages, you were involved at the time of the proposal to change the pressure arrangements in the multi-bed rooms. And I would just ask, to what extent, in your view, did discussions around that subject reflect the sort of collaborative partnership that the guidance talks about?
I think it reflected it pretty well. Despite a difference of opinion in terms of potential contractual liability, the teams actually worked very well together in coming up with a solution around the 4 beds. And I think that actually runs pretty much right through the job. The collaborative approach was there through the project in the main. There were quite a number of disagreements, there were a few disputes. However, to the side of that and ongoing throughout that, the collaboration still stayed.
But my understanding is that during the meetings to discuss the multi-bedroom pressure solution, NHSL's clinicians weren't involved. They weren't meeting directly with the designers. Is that your understanding?
I think in the main, NHSL worked with their own team away from us, but as far as certainly as far as I could see and evidence I had, they were consulting within their own teams. There were occasions that a couple of the people would come along to specific meetings. I would say that it's unusual to be able to get infection control people to all the meetings all the time. They're very busy and their time is much sought after in a number of areas across the healthcare facilities. So it's generally easier then for the NHS project team to meet them at a time convenient and upload and download all the information and bring that back. And as far as I could see, that was happening.
Mm-hmm. So you're describing there an approach in which the designers are meeting with the NHSL project team and then the project team separately shuttling back to meet the clinicians and discuss it with them. Is that...
Often, but not always, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think it would have made any difference if the clinicians had been present in the same room as the designers?
I don't know. Elements could well help, but when we're talking sometimes around pressure regimes and air changes, the clinicians might not always twig what that actually meant to them in the outturn position. Do I think it would be useful? I don't think it would be a hindrance, but I think it would be a large time drain on people for areas where they may only have a little bit of input.
Perhaps one of the challenges in this field is that infection control via engineering systems involves expertise from a variety of disciplines, so engineers, the clinicians using the space, IPC staff, and so on. Can you think of any improved way of working which would bridge the gap amongst all of those different professions?
I mean, are we touching on to the NHS Assure?
We will come on to that, but I'm interested in any ideas that you as an industry professional have.
It probably bridges across some of the NHS Assure things that I've read through there, but one goes around in terms of resourcing. I think the NHS overall are very stretched. They're people with specific knowledge, and that knowledge is massively beneficial to these projects. It's not knowledge that we possess, it's not knowledge that the project teams possess. And I do think the infection control side on this project was reasonably well supported from what I've seen on other jobs as well. However, that still falls on one person, and their availability is very restricted because of what else they've got to be committed to. So were it feasible to donate those resources into these projects from the outset, and certainly through the design phase, and then probably in and out of the construction phase and back at the commissioning phase, I think that would be massively beneficial overall.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one way of looking at what happened on this project is that one arm of the NHS publishes guidance with recommendations in it, and then another arm of the NHS, the Health Board, appoints designers and gives them the contractual obligation of complying with the guidance. And this is guidance which we've heard is sometimes open to interpretation. Is that an arrangement of responsibility that works well, or should responsibility for interpreting the guidance lie with the NHS?
I think the latter is better, because ultimately it's from the clinical delivery point of view that these buildings need to work. And when you then leave interpretation of anything to somebody who's not from that background, then they could be interpreted in a way that they have completely inadvertently gone away from the point of it in the first place without knowledge of doing so.
Yeah. You may or may not be aware that SHTM 0301 was itself revised in February 2022. Are you aware of that?
I am, yeah.
Yep. And have you worked with that guidance since it was?
I haven't worked directly with it, no, but I have read it as part of, slightly out of interest for today.
Okay, well, one of the things that guidance does is introduce the concept of the ventilation safety group. Is that something that you've been able to read about?
It is, yeah.
And what are your thoughts about that as a suggestion?
I think in concept it looks good. I think it's a step in the right direction for sure. There's possibly areas it may go further, and it may be intended to go further in the future, but I do think that that's a positive addition to the SHTM and a positive addition to the projects that will be built, constructed, commissioned and set to use under that SHTM.
And what would you regard as the positive features of it?
I think the whole thing is around getting expertise available to project teams, and when I say project teams, I'm not even necessarily meaning purely NHS project teams, but to the project teams on a whole, which will start from the planning feasibility stages, getting them access to relevant experts that can not so much even give guidance, but actually give firm direction, and an attempt to take away some of the ambiguity and some of the areas of interpretation, or at least have a defined interpretation on what it means, rather than each specific design team having its own interpretation.
Yeah, so to you as a contractor responsible for the delivery of places like this, is that matter of firm direction about the requirements an important one?
Yeah, very much so.
Bear with me a second, Mr Pike. Another thing that SHTM 0301 does is perhaps sharpen up the definition of clinical areas and critical systems. If we could go please to bundle 1, page 2288. And you see 4.12 there, we have the heading of definition of clinical areas and critical systems. Then there's a definition of clinical areas to distinguish them from non-clinical areas. And then at 4.13, it provides that certain clinical and non-clinical areas within a healthcare establishment are considered critical to its ability to provide healthcare. Typically, ventilation systems serving the following are considered critical. And we have down at the third bullet there, critical care areas and neonatal units. And then down at the bottom, there's a little box that says, if any doubt exists about whether a system falls within this definition, the ventilation safety group should be consulted regarding the risk to patient safety and business continuity. And is that an example of the kind of firm direction that you were saying is helpful?
Yes, it is. There's potential for it to maybe go a little further, but that's a big step in the right direction as I'll look at that.
And then if we go please to page 2431. This is Appendix 2 to the revised version of the guidance. And we can see it's perhaps a more detailed version of the table that used to be Appendix 1 of the old guidance. And if you see there, Mr Pike, in the box for general ward, there are now brackets saying level 0 and 1 care. And then further down in the box for critical care areas, there's a reference to level 2 and 3 care. Would you regard those as helpful improvements?
Yeah, I think that could have made a lot of difference if this was in place 2014. So yeah, very, very much helpful improvements.
So just expand on that. What difference do you think it might have made?
I think that it just brings away, so I just take 4-bed wards as an example, and our view in terms of general ward and other view in terms of single bedroom. You know, the more you can just take away that, it's not really even different interpretations. It's kind of fundamental different starting point to how you then go forward, the better. Yeah, and this table being more prescriptive, having more areas clearly defined as how they're supposed to be treated is very helpful.
And in particular, the classification of things by level of care, is that something that's meaningful to a healthcare ventilation designer?
Personally, I would have to just refresh my memory of what the level of cares are. However, they're not completely unknown, and it wouldn't take a huge amount of time to just get them. And there would be people within our team and within the project team that would know what they were and easy to refer to.
And if we keep in mind that you got involved in the project at a time when the environmental matrix had already specified 4 air changes per hour for the critical care rooms, do you think it would have made a difference to the way you handled the project if the guidance had been in these terms at the time?
I think if the guidance had been in these terms, that original position may not have come to be. In terms of how I handled the project, if I put myself back at that point in time, it may not have short term, because I would have still gone, what's the contract delivery? That would be my starting point. And to check what we were doing against our contractual obligations and then take things from there. So if those two things still tied up, I might not have looked. Obviously, having gone through this experience, it will be one of the first documents I looked at on any job going forward, but that's slightly coming from a slightly different educational position. I would like to think that the fact that it's got the level 2, level 3 care, level 0, level 1 care, and it's clear that the actual origin of the issue here wouldn't have been there to start with.
I mean, the guidance is obviously very long. It's now hundreds of pages. Is there anything more that you think could be done in the guidance to help ensure the right sort of engineering systems are being installed in hospitals?
I think everything I see is a positive move. You could still expand that table. I know that gets to a point of where do you stop, but I think there's still probably areas, and it might be worthwhile looking at current projects or projects that have started recently and asking them where have they seen potential conflict in interpretation as to whether there's a common theme coming up for additional rooms just to be clarified as clearly as these ones are. I think the guidance is in a tough position because it has to cover so many scenarios. It's meant to be used and relied upon as the guidance for whatever you do in various stages, from what might be a small dental refit in a small hospital to a massive multi-million-pound high acute hospital, and it's it has to try and attempt to cover all that whole range. So it's always going to be very difficult to keep specifics in there. Whether there's a potential to split parts to make them relevant to different sizes or scales or types might be something worth consideration. The other part, I'd say, might be slightly off question, but anyway, I'll state it. This is all in terms of guidance, and I think the Healthcare Assure and Ventilation Safety Group will be very good additions in supporting this and making sure it gets utilised in the correct manner. There is always the point, though, that all of this guidance through SHTMs are just flipped into mandatory contract documents, and it's just not as simple as that fundamentally, because within this guidance itself there's contradiction to other guidance, there's contradiction to other guidance. So just flipping it into a mandatory document is not as easy as it sounds, or it's not then interpreted back. And I think you've heard already that somebody's interpretation of it may not be somebody else's interpretation of it, and then therefore who's right and who's wrong. Mm-hmm. And it's a mandatory document to meet, but people will say they meet it and other people will say they don't. And so therefore it leaves too many open areas when treated like that.
Yeah.
But I get the purpose of it, and I think the purpose of it is excellent. I think the people writing it have a very difficult job to write it to cover every scenario they're trying to cover.
Okay, so if I try and just pick out the key themes from that, I think what you're saying is that at least up to a certain point, to have prescriptive requirements that are clear is helpful to the building contractor and the designer, but that there's a limit about how prescriptive it can be. Is that
no,
fair?
Actually not a limit to how prescriptive it can be, possibly the opposite. I think what I'm saying is the limit is when things just get thrown in buckets. Yep. So all SHGMs become mandatory, and the building contractor or the project delivery team had to sort that out, because they will sort it out in their own interpretations of it, and that gets away from potentially the clinical requirement that started off at the concept stage of the hospital, unintentionally sometimes. Or most of the time, I would think.
So you're describing there a need.
Probably a need to be more prescriptive.
A need to be more prescriptive.
Under an SHTM, there may be 3 ways to do something. We want you to do it, option B, and then it's crystal clear for everybody.
Or perhaps a need, once the designers and contractors have come up with a solution that meets their interpretation of the guidance, to be able to gain confidence that meets the expectations of either the health board or the people who set the guidance. Yeah,
I agree with that. That was something similar I wrote down, anticipating the question of what could be done differently under the IOM piece. So IOM came at the end to do the validation, and that's when issues were raised up. And I thought looking back through the history of everything and the amount of people looking at it and all of that, it's just been well and truly gone over, so I won't go over it again. If a body like OM had come and done a desktop version of their validation right back at the start, possibly pre-financial close, possibly even pre-bid acceptance, certainly RDD or end of RDD, that could have made a lot of difference. And I think that's similar to what you're just inferring to there, like our Golden Gate review, that's a gateway to progress, that certain experts come in, re-review, ensure that, yeah, we're content and we're comfortable with that interpretation, and things can proceed.
Okay, I think I know the passage that you're referring to. And if we could go to page 2402. Down at the bottom of the page, we've got the design proposal review. And what the guidance now says is that it's essential that whoever has been appointed to carry out the final validation acceptance of the system should be involved in the initial client's brief and design specification, preferably prior to the project being put out to tender. They will then be fully aware of the client's requirements and any limiting factors. Is that the process that you were discussing?
That's pretty much part of it, yeah. And
you would regard that as a good improvement?
I would, yes. And I would. And I think Assure may do this, but I think taking that review again at the RDD point, just prior to everything getting pressed from manufacturing and construction, would be another good point to do it.
Yeah.
Can you just help me with this, Mr. Pike? In this context, the RDD process involved quite a lot of data and carried on after financial close. Now, as I understand it, that's unusual. One would expect an RDD process after financial close, but perhaps more limited than occurred in this case. So when you're talking, when you use the expression by the end of RDD, you're talking about contracts in general, but it would be after financial close, but that's assuming that there's not really a great deal of data to review, or is that oversimplifying what you've said?
No, it's pretty much on the right track. I think we're saying this review happens as indicated in the document pre-tender engagement, pre-tender, and then there is a point in time prior to, I'll call it pressing the button, but prior to starting manufacture, starting construction, that it's just rechecked again to make sure nothing has gone away between the bid returns, the acceptance, and the technical reviews. That it then says, yes, that still aligns with what we intended at the outset.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Pike. Now, you've already referred to NHS Assure, which has been set up. NHS Assure is a division of NHS National Services Scotland, and one of its aims is to provide assurance to the Scottish Government about compliance with guidance, and that's done via a series of key stage assurance reviews. Now, do you have any experience of a project where these key stage assurance reviews have been in place?
Not in healthcare, no, I haven't worked under this piece of experience of other projects in other sectors that have a, not as in-depth as this is now proposed, but have a similar kind of key stage, key gateway review.
Okay, which other industries have something similar to this?
I worked for the prison service on a number of jobs, and they have a gateway review system in place, which was very beneficial.
And is that a gateway concerned with compliance with guidance for engineering systems and design and that kind of thing, or is it for other purposes?
It probably covers all purposes, but yes, that became part of it, or that was part of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. In preparing for today, have you had an opportunity to look through any of the documents that Assure has published about these key stage assurance reviews?
Yes, I had a read of it. I'll call it a brief read, not an
Well, fair enough, and well done for taking it on, because there's quite a lot of reading. But do you have any observations or comments about that from the reading that you've done?
Yeah, my first and main observation is it looks a positive step again. And I can see they've identified, I call gateway reviews, but review points throughout the journey of a project's life. I can see the intent to give access / bring access to specialists in the area, people with more specific knowledge of areas than a normal project team may have. So I think it looks like a very positive step for me overall, certainly in concept. I've never worked with it, so I don't know how it is working, but I do have a couple of colleagues that are currently working under schemes, not the Multiplex ex-colleagues, sorry, and they seem to welcome it.
And the process, as I understand it, is intended to give assurance to the Scottish Government, who are often funding these projects, and it's the burden or the task of demonstrating compliance essentially rests on the Health Board. Do you know what impact, if any, it has on the work for the contractors on these projects?
Not firsthand, I don't, but I would think it could well bring in additional work at that front end of the project. I'm not sure what it brings in the bid stage for the contractor, but I would anticipate it also brings in quite a bit more work for the health boards pre-contract in the early stage of the project.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Mr Pike. I don't have any more questions for you. There's a possibility that some of the core participants may have a question, and I think the normal practice is to break for them to have an opportunity to raise those points with me. So, my lord, that may be...
Yes, that's what we'll do. And I think the way I'd suggest we choreograph this is that we take 10 or 15 minutes and with a view to being able to tell Mr Pike whether there are further questions before lunch as opposed to after lunch. So we'll rise for about 10 or 15 minutes, Mr Pike, ask you to go back to the witness room, and the purpose is to confirm whether we have further questions.
Okay, thank you.
We have one question, my lord.
One question, and you will ask that question.
I'm happy to ask it.
Right. Good. Thanks, Drew. I'm told there's one more question.
Thank you, Mr Pike. Now, you just a few moments ago, we were discussing the Ventilation Safety Group and NHS Assure, and your view was that they were helpful additions to the field. I think partly because of their expertise and partly also because of their objectivity, I suspect. Now, on this project, there was an independent tester, Arcadis, who might, from one point of view, be regarded as another set of eyes on what was going on. But they didn't detect the issue. It was IOM coming in that spotted it. And so the question is, would you see the Ventilation Safety Group and NHS Assure bringing something different to what an independent tester would bring?
Yeah, I think they have to bring something different. And what I've taken from the documents I've read around the purpose is they are much more to look at compliance to technical standards. The independent tester's role, from my experience, is to check that the contract has been met. So if there is a point in there that perhaps the starting point is debatable, he will not look to pick that up. He will look back at what he considers to be the contract.
Yes, so the tester is not going to detect a discrepancy between the contract and the guidance.
No.
And that's where you would see the VSG and Assure bringing something different.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pike. I appreciate your attendance and the work that went behind that in preparing your witness statement. So thank you very much indeed, Mr. Pike. You're now free to go.
Thank you. Apologies.
Well, a moment for lunch perhaps, or maybe not a moment, maybe an hour for lunch. So might sit again about 2:05.